Well, these random deadlines are very similar to the way we've got random net zero deadlines for 2030 and 2050 from the Labor Party. We set the deadline, but we don't adjudicate whether things can continue. For instance, can the lights continue to stay on while we're building renewable farms? Can we find the technology that's commercially viable to make sure methane can be reduced by 30% before that deadline? You set the target after you do your due diligence on the technology, David.
Exactly, and that's why there is no linear pathway to net zero by 2050, and that's why we wanted to make sure that we invested in the technology, and we said we could only get to around 85% of the way, and that we were going to have to rely on emerging technology later down the track. But that's why we looking at protecting those traditional industries with carbon capture storage, and look to the new industries like nuclear, small-scale modular nuclear. That means that we can get there with a solution, but we can peek over the Pacific and make sure we do that responsibly, adopt and adapt, and we don't have the lights turned off. This reckless pace in which Chris Bowen is going at is putting a lot of pressure on households, and they're feeling it. No one's saying we shouldn't live up to our international commitment, but we don't have to rush into it. We got to 2050. That is our licence to trade. When we signed up to that, we made sure that we were able to continue to trade without tariffs being put on us and interest rates going up. So we've got a long way to go to 2050, and there is no linear pathway to that, and we don't have to rush if we don't have the solution right now.
Yeah, you've nailed it there with the term reckless pace, both in terms of climate change goals and what they're doing with methane, as we discovered today. I just see the politics in this. Is this Anthony Albanese wanting to turn up to Egypt and go one better than Scott Morrison, show that he's superior in the green space and say, look what we're doing, we'll agree to something that Scott Morrison didn't agree to? And yet he didn't raise it at the election, David. It reminds me very much of there won't be any carbon tax under the government I lead.
No, and this is about honesty with the Australian people. I suspect it is to be able to make an announcement at COP27, and this will be all at the expense of Australian consumers and Australian farmers if we don't see the detail. And that's why it's important they come clean with this. They've already tried to backtrack from the tax cuts, the LAW law tax cuts that they voted for, that have gone through. They were trying to kite flight and try and walk away from that. They've walked away from $275 commitment of reducing your electricity, and now the electricity price is going up because of the pace that they're going at. This is all about platitudes and not about the practical reality, the application of the policy of what they're putting out there. Their ideology is all grand, but when you get to the practical application, there are real costs, and those real costs are being paid by Australian consumers now, and that cost of living crisis is squarely at Anthony Albanese's feet.
You've been calling on the government in recent weeks to fess up about whether there'll be any new taxes for farmers around the country. Have you had anything back from the Treasurer or the Finance Minister on that?
No, and look, I actually raised this methane issue about a month after the election to make sure that they would give certainty. I got nothing back then, and still seeing nothing now. So this is the thing, is where we call for public certainty, and I made those statements public about calling on Chris Bowen to give us certainty around methane emissions. He was silent. In fact, he's still silent today. It's Murray Watt, and I don't have confidence that Murray Watt's in the conversation in the tent with Labor. I think it's important that Chris Bowen, who's going to be formulating these policies, and the Prime Minister come out and tell us the truth about what are their plans around this methane commitment and how we're going to get there, because the science is not as convincing as we'd like it at the moment. We've got to be honest about that, and we've got to be able to, if we're going to make an international commitment, you've got to have credibility, you've got to have standing. Otherwise, if you make a commitment you can't live up to it, then you lose your international standing. We've lived up to all that we've said we would. And it's time we made sure that we continue to keep that with honesty and truth.
Well, if they were running this methane so-called problem like a business, they would go and see those technological nerds that run these trials and work out with them side by side exactly when it will be ready and commercially viable, not sitting in Canberra pinning the tail on the donkey on a particular percentage by a certain date.
Yeah, and that's why these trials are very comprehensive. They're large companies doing it at scale, because if you're going to hang your hat on this technology around feed additives that'll reduce it, you need to be able to do it conclusively and at scale. The meeting I had this morning raised real concerns with me around the effectiveness of this and the cost, and that's a real issue. So signing up to a pledge without that already in the kit bag worries me, and then it means that governments are forced to look to other measures to try and reduce these methane emissions by 30%. And that's why Chris Bowen needs to come clean on this and be honest and look the Australian people in the eye and make sure that he can give them certainty that there will be no methane tax, there will be no reduction in the herd to achieve this, and that farmers will be able to continue to produce the way they do.
Yep. Good to have you on the Bolt Report, David Littleproud. Thank you very much for your time.